The shocking inheritance. The sky above the alien city was heavy with violet clouds that carried a strange metallic glow, and the air was filled with the deep humming of ceremonial drums played by creatures taller than any human could ever grow. David stood among them as the only man from Earth, a figure who felt both honored and misplaced in this gathering of beings who carried themselves with such proud silence. Today was the funeral of Kryl, the alien who had once been his closest friend, and the only reason David had survived the wars that had nearly destroyed him years ago. He remembered the day Kryl had pulled him out of a burning battlefield, saving him when no one else would have lifted a hand for a human stranded so far from home. Now that same friend lay in a towering crystal casket surrounded by glowing flowers that gave off a light so bright it stung David's eyes. The aliens bowed their heads in unison, murmuring in their low, rumbling voices words David did not understand. He kept his head lowered anyway out of respect, though his heart ached with grief and a strange sense of guilt. He had not expected to be here. He had not expected to be the one among them when Kryl's own kind filled the plaza by the thousands. The ceremony stretched on until finally the Council of Elders stepped forward, their cloaks shimmering like living fire as they raised their staffs. The hum of the drums quieted, and the crowd turned their attention to the speaker, whose eyes glowed pale silver. His voice echoed across the plaza, announcing the contents of Kryl's last will. David expected the wealth and titles to pass to another alien, perhaps a brother or cousin. But as the elder spoke, the crowd erupted in gasps and whispers. The elder's voice did not tremble as he declared that everything Kryl had owned, from his estates on the mountain ridges to the fleets of ships that bore his crest, had been left not to his bloodline, but to David the human who stood small and uncertain in the crowd. David froze, unable to process the words, his heart pounding with confusion. He wanted to protest, to shout that it must be a mistake, but the elder had not finished. The voice carried again, stronger, this time declaring that Kryl's final and most sacred wish was that David would take into his care his wife Lyra. At that moment the whispers turned to sharp cries, and the plaza shook with outrage. Aliens stepped forward, their faces twisted in disbelief, some pointing accusing fingers at David, as if he had already stolen what was not his. He wanted to shrink into the ground, to run away from the gaze of thousands, but his legs would not move. Then from the edge of the ceremonial steps she appeared, Lyra, the widow of his friend. Her beauty was unlike anything David had ever seen before. Her skin shimmered faintly with a shade of silver that caught every glimmer of light, and her eyes burned with a deep golden fire that seemed to pierce straight through him. She moved with the grace of someone raised in power and pride, yet her face was pale with grief, her lips pressed tight as she walked toward him. Every step she took silenced the crowd until the plaza was quiet again, except for the slow hum of the wind. When she finally stopped before him, David could not breathe. She was taller than him by almost a head, and every part of her presence reminded him that she belonged to a world he could never truly understand. Yet when her eyes met his, he saw not hatred, but something else, a question burning quietly beneath her grief. She leaned forward just enough that only he could hear her whisper, though every alien eye in the plaza was fixed on them. "Why did he choose you?" she asked, her voice breaking with both sorrow and disbelief. David could not answer, because he did not know. He wanted to tell her that Kryl had been his friend, that he would never have wished for this, that he had no desire to inherit anything, not the ships, not the wealth, and certainly not the woman who stood before him. Yet the words caught in his throat, because saying them would not undo what had been spoken in the presence of thousands. The will of Kryl was law among his people, and none would dare to break it. The council elder raised his staff again, declaring that the will had been sealed by Kryl's own hand before his death, and that resistance to it would be seen as resistance to Kryl himself. The crowd murmured with discontent, but none stepped forward to challenge openly. Still, David could feel their hatred like knives pressing against his skin. He knew in that instant that he was no longer just an outsider in their eyes, but a usurper, someone who had taken what they believed belonged to their own kind. Lyra turned from him, then her cloak swirling behind her as she walked back toward the ceremonial steps, her shoulders stiff with anger and grief. David felt a hollowness open inside him, because he had lost his friend, and now he had been given something he never wanted, something that felt more like a curse than an inheritance. The drums began again, low and heavy, as Kryle's casket was raised high into the air and carried toward the flames that would turn it into a pillar of ash rising into the violet sky. David kept his eyes on the smoke until it disappeared, but the weight of Lyra's whispered question still burned in his chest, and he knew this was only the beginning of something far greater and far more dangerous than he could yet imagine. The suspicion and the bond. The days following the funeral stretched into a blur for David, who found himself trapped inside Kryle's grand estate that now by law belonged to him, yet never felt like it was truly his. The estate was a vast structure carved into the cliffs, overlooking rivers of molten light that glowed in the darkness of night. Alien servants who once obeyed only Kryle now bowed stiffly to David, their eyes filled with suspicion and quiet resentment. Every hallway whispered of judgment, every chamber seemed to carry the weight of Kryle's presence, and none of it gave David peace. Lyra moved through those same halls like a shadow wrapped in silence, her footsteps barely echoing against the polished stone floors. She never spoke to him unless duty forced her to, and when she did, her words were sharp and measured, as if to remind him he was a stranger in her world. David understood her coldness and did not blame her. He had lost a friend, but she had lost a husband, and now the law had bound her to someone who had never been part of her choice. At night, when the estate was quiet, David often wandered through the balcony gardens where glowing vines curled around crystal pillars and the alien stars shimmered, brighter than any he had seen on Earth. He thought about Kryle's laughter, the way his deep voice had carried warmth and strength in battles where death was only a breath away. Kryle had trusted him with his life, and now he had trusted him with something even heavier, but David could not understand why. The more he tried to piece it together, the more restless he became. The alien society beyond the estate walls did not welcome him. When he walked through the markets with Lyra, following a few paces behind, the stares of the people burned into him like fire. Some whispered openly that a human had stolen what was sacred, others spat on the ground as he passed, and a few muttered threats that chilled his blood. Lyra noticed it all, but she never stepped forward to defend him. She walked with her head high, carrying the dignity of her kind, but she too did not hide her doubts. One evening, after returning from the council chambers, where David had been forced to sign documents transferring Kryle's fleets and lands into his name, Lyra confronted him in the great hall. Her golden eyes glowed faintly in the dim light as she crossed her arms and studied him with a mixture of grief and suspicion. She asked him why he accepted these gifts when he claimed he never wanted them. She demanded to know whether this was his plan all along, to cling to Kryle, only to snatch everything the moment death opened the way. David felt her words strike deep, but he did not raise his voice. He told her quietly that he had never wished for any of this, that Kryle's friendship had been enough for him, that wealth and titles meant nothing because he came from a world where he had lived in simplicity and even poverty. He told her that if the council would let him, he would walk away and return to Earth with nothing but the memory of his friend. Lyra studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing as if she wanted to catch a flicker of falsehood, but all she found was the raw truth in his voice. She said nothing more that night and walked away, but something in her gaze had softened, though only slightly. The turning point came when the estate was attacked. It was late night, and David had been in the library studying alien texts he barely understood when the alarms blared a deep rising sound that rattled the walls. Armed figures slipped through the gates, their weapons flashing as they cut down the guards. David rushed into the corridor, only to find himself face to face with two towering intruders, their eyes filled with rage as they called him a thief of honor and a defiler of tradition. Before he could even think, one raised a blade aimed at his chest. Instinct took over as David grabbed a metal staff from the wall, swinging it with all the strength he had. The clash rang out through the corridor, sparks flying as he blocked the strike, though the force nearly knocked him to the floor. The second attacker lunged, but before they could reach him, Lyra appeared from the shadows wielding a curved blade that shimmered with golden energy. She moved with fierce precision, her strikes elegant yet deadly, and within moments, both attackers lay defeated on the cold stone floor. Breathless, David leaned against the wall, gripping the staff as sweat rolled down his face. Lyra stood over the fallen intruders, her chest rising with heavy breaths, her expression unreadable as she turned her gaze toward him. For the first time since Kryle's death, there was no coldness in her eyes, only a flicker of surprise that the human had not cowered or fled, but had stood and fought when death loomed. After the attackers were dragged away by the guards, David and Lyra found themselves in the quiet aftermath of the chaos. He asked her why Kryle's own people would come for him, and she hesitated before answering. She told him that Kryle had been more than a soldier, more than a respected leader. He had been part of something greater, something dangerous that had left him with many enemies. She said that Kryle had known his death was near, and that perhaps this was why he had chosen David to inherit everything, because only an outsider could be overlooked by those who wished to destroy him. David felt his heart grow heavy with those words. He returned to his chamber that night, restless, unable to sleep. When he finally sat at Kryle's old desk, he discovered a hidden compartment, sealed with a symbol he remembered from Kryle's armor. Inside was a small crystalline cube that glowed faintly when touched. As he turned it in his hands, a soft light spilled across the room, forming the image of Kryle himself. The voice that followed was weaker than David remembered, yet still carried the strength of a man who had once led armies. Kryle spoke directly to him, telling him that if he was seeing this message, it meant that death had come sooner than he hoped. He said that the Empire was growing darker, and that war was nearer than anyone wished to admit. He told David that his choice had not been an accident, and that above all else, he must protect Lyra because she carried knowledge and strength that the Empire feared. David sat frozen as the light flickered out, leaving the room dark again. Words of his friend echoed in his mind, and he finally understood that what he had inherited was not just wealth or a widow's companionship, but a secret burden that could ignite conflict across the stars. He clenched his fists, his heart heavy, yet burning with resolve, because no matter what lay ahead, he would not fail. The last request of the only friend who had ever believed in him, Secrets of the Alien, wore the message from Kryle, replayed again and again inside David's mind, as if every word had been carved into the deepest part of him. And when dawn broke over the violet skies, he did not feel rested, but weighed down by the burden of what he had learned. Lyra noticed the change in him that morning when they met in the council chamber that overlooked the glowing rivers. She asked him what troubled him, but he hesitated, unsure whether to reveal the truth. Finally, he told her about the hidden cube and Kryle's message about the Empire and the war that was coming. Lyra listened without interrupting, her golden eyes fixed on him with a sharpness that made his chest tighten. When he finished, she walked to the tall windows, her cloak sweeping the floor as she stood staring at the horizon. Then, in a voice low but steady, she admitted that she had known parts of Kryle's secret, but not the whole truth. She explained that Kryle had been a leader in a silent rebellion against the Empire, a rebellion that few dared to speak of because the Empire's power stretched across the stars like an unending shadow. David felt his stomach twist as her words sank in. Kryle had never spoken of rebellion, not to him, not in all their years of friendship. He remembered their long talks by the fire when Kryl spoke of honor and freedom. David had thought it was only the pride of his people, never realizing that behind those words had been an actual struggle against tyranny. Now everything made sense. The enemies who had attacked the estate, the whispers in the market, the fear in the eyes of the council. Kryl had left him not just wealth, but the key to a fight that had been hidden for years. Lyra turned to him, then, and her face was no longer cold, but fierce as she told him that she too had been part of Kryl's plans. She had stood beside her husband, not only as his wife, but as his partner in the rebellion. She had carried messages between allies, hidden weapons within the estate, and memorized codes that could open secret vaults. Kryl had trusted her with his life, but for reasons she could not yet understand, he had trusted David to continue the work after his death. David shook his head, saying he was no leader, no warrior, only a man who had once been a soldier fighting on battlefields. He barely survived. He told her that humans were not like her people, with their advanced fleets and their strength. Yet Lyra stepped closer, her eyes burning, as she told him that Kryl had seen something in him that went beyond weapons and power. She said that humans carried a stubbornness, a will to fight, even when the odds were hopeless, and that Kryl had believed this quality was what the rebellion needed most. Her words did not fill him with confidence, but with a heavy sense of responsibility. He wanted to refuse to turn away and return to Earth, but when he thought of Kryl's voice in the message and the promise he had made in his heart, he knew he could not run. That night Lyra led him to the deepest chamber of the estate, where the walls were lined with crystals that pulsed faintly as if alive. She pressed her hand against a hidden panel in the floor, shifted, revealing a stairway spiraling downward. They descended into the hidden vault, and there David saw what Kryl had concealed. Rows of weapons forged with alien fire lay in sealed containers, each glowing faintly as if hungry for battle. Maps and star charts covered the walls, marked with roots and coded symbols. And in the center stood a console that pulsed with energy, showing the positions of Imperial fleets scattered across the galaxy. Lyra explained that Kryl had been preparing for a final move, gathering allies across distant systems, but his death had left the plan unfinished. David felt overwhelmed by the scale of it all, but Lyra's voice carried steady as she said, the rebellion had been waiting for a signal, and now the responsibility had passed to him. He could not understand why these warriors would follow a human, but she explained that Kryl's final word was law to many of them, and if Kryl had chosen David, they would respect it, even if they doubted at first. Before he could answer, the estate shook violently with the sound of explosions echoing above. The walls trembled, dust falling from the ceiling as alarms began to howl through the corridors. Lyra rushed to the console, her eyes narrowing as she read the incoming signals. She told David that Imperial soldiers had surrounded the estate, demanding that he and Lyra surrender themselves at once. David's blood ran cold. The Empire had moved faster than he imagined. Lyra drew her blade, her expression fierce as she told him they could not surrender, because once captured, they would be executed before the rebellion ever had a chance to rise. She handed him a smaller weapon, one shaped like a narrow rod that hummed when gripped, and told him he must fight not as a warrior of her people, but as himself, because unpredictability was his strength. They raced up the stairs, emerging into the great hall where smoke already drifted through the shattered windows. Soldiers in dark armor poured inside, their weapons glowing with deadly light. David's heart pounded as he stood beside Lyra, gripping the strange weapon, uncertain of how to use it. The soldiers shouted commands in harsh voices, ordering them to kneel. Lyra did not move, and neither did David. The moment of silence broke into chaos as the soldiers charged. Lyra moved like lightning, her blade flashing arcs of golden fire cutting through their ranks. David swung wildly at first, but soon found rhythm, using his smaller size to dodge between the armored giants, striking where their armor was weakest. His arms ached, his breath came ragged, yet he kept fighting, driven by a will he did not know he carried. The battle raged through the estate until the floors were slick with sparks and ash. Still more soldiers stormed in, forcing them back, step by step. Lyra shouted that they had to escape through the hidden passages Kryl had built. Together they fled down corridors that twisted through the cliffs, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. David's chest burned, his legs heavy, but he forced himself onward. When at last they emerged into the cold night air, they stood upon a ridge overlooking the glowing rivers. Dozens of Imperial ships hovered in the sky, their lights sweeping across the land like the eyes of predators. David felt the hopelessness of their situation pressing down upon him like a weight. Yet beside him, Lyra stood tall, her blade still burning, her eyes unbroken. He realized in that moment that this was only the beginning of the war Kryl had warned of. The Empire would not stop until they were both destroyed and the rebellion crushed. He looked at Lyra, and for the first time she did not see him as an intruder or a thief, but as someone who stood with her against the same darkness. Together they turned away from the burning estate, their hearts heavy, but their resolve unshaken. Behind them, the Empire's soldiers shouted their names across the night, but ahead lay the unknown path of Kryl's rebellion and the dangerous secret that David now carried. He did not know if he could survive what was coming, but he knew he could not abandon it either, for the memory of his friend, and the fire in Lyra's eyes had already bound him to this fight. The human advantage the night carried them far from the estate as they moved through rocky paths hidden among the cliffs, with only the dim glow of alien stars to guide their way. David's muscles ached from the battle and every breath felt heavy, yet he pressed on because he knew stopping meant capture, and capture meant death. Lyra walked beside him, her stride strong, though her cloak was torn from combat, and her blade still faintly glowed with the energy of the fight. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence broken only by the distant hum of Imperial ships searching above. At last, when they reached a cavern carved into the mountainside, Lyra raised her hand, signaling for them to rest. Inside the cavern, the air was cool and filled with faint light from crystals embedded in the walls. David slumped against the stone, letting the exhaustion wash over him, but his eyes never left the cavern's entrance. Lyra stood guard for a moment, her golden eyes scanning the night, before she sat across from him. For the first time since they had met, her expression softened just enough for him to see the weight she carried. She told him that the Empire's attack meant they had little time to gather allies. The rebellion Kryl had built was scattered across distant systems, and without leadership it would collapse before striking a single blow. David asked her how they could possibly unite people who might not even trust a human, and she replied that trust was not the key, survival was. If the Empire crushed, them all would suffer, and even the most divided factions would understand that. David listened, but doubt filled him. He was not a strategist nor a commander. He was a man caught in the current of events far greater than himself. Yet as he sat there, he remembered Kryl's words about protecting Lyra and about the war approaching. He thought of Earth's history of battles fought by men and women who had no chance but refused to surrender. He told Lyra quietly that perhaps he could not lead as Kryl had, but he could fight differently, because humans were not predictable like the Empire's soldiers. Lyra tilted her head, studying him as if she were seeing him in a new light. She asked him what he meant, and he explained how in human wars victory often came not from greater strength but from surprise, from using tricks and strategies the enemy could not anticipate. He spoke of persistence, of the way humans endured hardship with stubbornness that sometimes confused their enemies into mistakes. Lyra listened, her eyes thoughtful, and for the first time she allowed herself to admit that perhaps Kryl had been right about choosing David. The following days turned into a blur of movement as they traveled from one hidden outpost to another, meeting fragments of Kryl's allies. Many were suspicious when they saw David, their voices sharp with disbelief that a human carried Crow's mantle. Some even threatened to walk away, but Lyra stood beside him, declaring that Kryle's choice was sacred and binding. She told them that if they trusted Kryle once, they must trust his will now. Still, it was not her words alone that began to sway them. David noticed that during meetings when strategies were discussed, the rebels often repeated the same patterns of thought, the same logical approaches that made sense to them as warriors bred in a rigid culture. He began to interject, offering ideas that seemed reckless to them, but drew their attention. He spoke of deception, of feigned retreats, of ambushes set in places no one expected. At first they laughed, dismissing his thoughts as the ignorance of a human, but when small tests proved his ideas worked, they began to watch him with new eyes. Lyra observed all of this silently, yet her gaze lingered on him more often, and her words toward him grew less cold. She began to share her own knowledge, openly telling him about codes hidden in old songs, maps that led to secret caches of supplies and safe havens spread across the systems. Together, they pieced the fragments of Kryle's rebellion into something that began to resemble a plan. But the Empire did not remain blind. One evening, as they camped near the edge of a canyon, the night lit up with the glare of descending ships. Imperial soldiers poured from the sky, weapons blazing as they surrounded the camp. Panic spread among the rebels, many ready to flee, but David shouted for them to hold. He told them the Empire expected them to scatter, and that scattering would mean slaughter. Instead, he urged them to pretend retreat, only to draw the soldiers into the canyon, where the walls would turn their numbers into a trap. Though uncertain, the rebels listened, if only because fear left them no choice. They fell back into the canyon, luring the Empire's forces deeper. When the soldiers advanced confident of their victory, David gave the signal, and hidden charges buried in the rock exploded, sending boulders crashing down. The narrow space turned into chaos as the rebels struck from above, hurling fire and blade while the Empire's formation collapsed. By dawn, the canyon floor was littered with wreckage, and for the first time in many years, the rebels had won a battle against their oppressors. That victory echoed far across the systems. Word spread quickly that Kryle's rebellion was not dead, and that under strange new leadership, it had struck a blow no one thought possible. More fighters began to rally to their side, and slowly the rebellion gained strength. Yet with strength came greater danger, for the Empire now understood that David was not just a nuisance, but a threat. The Council of the Empire declared him an outlaw and set a price upon his head. Posters with his likeness appeared in markets, though distorted to show him as a monster. He became the hunted one whose capture promised fortune. David felt the weight of this every time he looked into a mirror, seeing his own reflection twisted by propaganda, yet he carried on because turning back was no longer possible. Lyra stood by him through it all, her presence becoming less like a shadow of Kryle's memory and more like a partner in the fight. She trained him with alien weapons, teaching him how to blend human instinct with alien skill. They argued often, for she was fierce and proud while he was stubborn and reckless, but through those clashes grew a strange bond forged in fire and danger. At times when the night was quiet and the stars seemed endless, they shared stories of their world, stories of Earth's simple struggles and of her people's proud traditions. Slowly the distance between them began to fade, yet fate did not allow them peace for long. On the eve of their greatest gathering, when the rebel leaders assembled in secret to plan a strike against the Empire's heart, David's camp was betrayed. Imperial soldiers swept in with overwhelming force, capturing many rebels and setting the stronghold ablaze. David fought until his arms could move no more, but at last he was struck down and bound. As he was dragged away, he caught one last glimpse of Lyra fighting against the tide, her blade a streak of light among shadows. Their eyes met across the flames, and in that moment he felt both fear and hope, for she would not abandon him, no matter the cost. Then the soldiers forced him into a ship, the doors sealing shut as the engines roared. The rebellion had risen, but its leader was now a prisoner, and the Empire prepared to make an example of the human who dared to inherit the legacy of Kryll. The final legacy, the Empire's prison ship cut across the endless dark with its steel hull glimmering faintly under the light of distant stars. And inside David lay in chains, his wrists bruised and his body weary from the endless march of guards who shoved him through corridors like a trophy. He could hear their mocking voices as they spoke of the trial that awaited him, a trial that was not meant to judge, but to humiliate and destroy the symbol of rebellion Kryll had left behind. They said the people would see the human broken and bleeding before the throne, and the rebellion would collapse into silence. David sat on the cold floor of his cell, feeling the weight of his failure pressing against his chest like iron. He thought of Kryll's laughter, of the day he had promised to protect Lyra, and of the battles where he had stood not as a hero, but as a man who refused to fall. Now he was chained and alone, and he wondered if this was how it would all end, not in fire, not in victory, but in quiet defeat, carried through the Empire as nothing more than a prisoner. But he did not know that beyond the prison ship, Lyra had not surrendered. She had escaped the ambush bloodied, but unbroken, and had rallied what remained of the rebels with a voice that carried both grief and fury. She told them that if they allowed David to be executed, then Kryll's legacy would die with him, and the rebellion would vanish into the dust of forgotten wars. She promised that no matter the cost she would not abandon him, and that if any still believed in freedom, they must follow her. So it was that a fleet of stolen ships cloaked in silence followed the path of the prison vessel like hunters moving through the void. Lyra herself led them, her eyes fixed upon the stars, with a determination that left no room for fear. She knew the risk was almost madness, for the prison vessel was guarded by Imperial warships, yet she also knew that rebellion was born in madness, in the refusal to bow even when reason demanded surrender. Inside the prison ship, David was brought before the Imperial commander, a towering figure in black armor whose voice carried the chill of stone. The commander told him that his execution would be broadcast across 1,000 systems, so that every rebel would see what became of those who defied the Empire. David listened, but in his heart he no longer felt fear, only a quiet resolve, for if this was the end, he would not kneel, he would not give them the satisfaction of breaking him. The ship jolted suddenly, alarms screaming through the corridors. Guards stumbled, the commander shouted orders, and through the walls came the unmistakable roar of weapons fire. David's heart leapt as he realized only one thing could cause such chaos. Lyra had come. The cell doors blew open under the strike of rebel charges, and there she stood, framed by smoke and fire, her blade burning with golden light as rebels surged behind her. David staggered to his feet, his chains still binding his wrists, but his spirit blazing as Lyra cut him free. She told him the fleet was waiting, and that they must fight their way out together. The corridors of the prison ship became a battlefield filled with the clash of metal and the screams of dying soldiers. David fought with nothing but a stolen blade, yet every strike carried the weight of his will, and beside him, Lyra carved a path like fire through the night. They reached the hangar where Imperial ships stood in rows guarded by armored squads. Battle raged fiercely as rebels clashed with soldiers in a storm of light and steel. David saw the commander again, towering above the chaos, and knew the fight would not end until he faced him. With every ounce of strength he had left, he charged his blade, meeting the commander's crushing blows. The alien was stronger, faster, and armored, but David carried something the Empire had never understood. He carried stubbornness that refused to yield. He feigned weakness, luring the commander into overconfidence, then struck with sudden ferocity, driving the blade deep through the armor. The giant fell, and the rebels roared with renewed fury. Lyra seized the moment, commanding the rebels to board the captured ships. Together she and David fought their way onto the bridge, where they took control of the vessel, turning its weapons against the Imperial escorts. Explosions lit the void as rebel fire tore through the Empire's fleet. For the first time the hunters became the hunted, and across the galaxy, whispers spread that the rebellion had struck not in secret, but in open war. When the battle ended, the prison ship burned among the stars while the rebels escaped into the void, carrying with them their first true victory. In the silence that followed, David stood beside Lyra on the bridge, his body bruised and torn, yet his spirit unbroken. She looked at him, her golden eyes softer, now filled not with suspicion, but with a strange warmth. She told him that Kryll had been right, that the Empire had never understood the human heart, and that perhaps it was that heart which would lead them to freedom. David felt the weight of Kryll's legacy upon him, but it no longer crushed him. It steadied him. He knew he was not Kryll, he would never be the warrior his friend had been, yet he also knew that he did not need to be. He was human, and that meant something different, unpredictable, stubborn, resilient. He turned to Lyra and told her that if she was willing, he would stand beside her, not as her master nor as the inheritor of titles, but as her partner in this fight. She smiled faintly, and for the first time since Kryll's death, she let her hand rest upon his. Around them the rebels spoke of new plans, of worlds waiting to rise, of a war that would only grow fiercer. But in that moment between them, there was no grief, only resolve, and something fragile, but real, born out of fire and loss. The galaxy would remember Kryll as a fallen hero, and David as the human who inherited more than wealth or a wife. He inherited a cause that refused to die. The Empire had believed they could crush the rebellion by capturing him, yet in doing so they had ignited the very fire they feared most. As the rebel fleet slipped into the endless dark, leaving behind the ruins of the battle, David looked out at the stars. He thought of Earth, and of how small his world once had seemed, compared to the vastness of the galaxy. Now that same vastness stretched before him, not as a prison, but as a promise. He whispered to himself words Kryll had once said, that freedom was not given, but taken by those who refused to surrender. Beside him, Lyra stood silent, her golden eyes fixed on the same stars, and together they stepped forward into the unknown. The war had only begun, but they carried with them something the Empire could never destroy, not with fleets, not with fear, not with death itself. They carried the human heart and the fire of a friendship that even death could not extinguish. So their journey continued, not as widow and heir, but as partners, bound by fate and by choice, ready to carve their own legacy into the stars. The end.